When my sister Celeste found that rusted 1969 Mustang buried under decades of leaves in our late grandfather's barn, we thought we'd discovered treasure. But when she ran the VIN number, what came back wasn't just a car's history. It was a love story that ended in Vietnam, and a promise that had been waiting 54 years to be kept. The morning sun streamed through the dusty windows of Grandpa Tobias's barn as Celeste pulled away the rotting tarp with both hands. What we expected to find was another piece of forgotten farm equipment, maybe some old tools we could sell to help settle the estate. What we actually found changed everything we thought we knew about our family. "Devin, get over here right now," Celeste called, her voice cutting through the musty air. When I reached her side, I saw what had stopped her cold. Beneath decades of accumulated dust and fallen leaves sat a pristine 1969 Ford Mustang Boss 302, its grabber orange paint gleaming like it had just rolled off the showroom floor. The racing stripes were perfect, the chrome unblemished, and when Celeste popped the hood, the engine looked like it had never been driven. But that wasn't what made my hands shake as I held the camera. It wasn't even the military dog tags we found in the glove compartment or the Purple Heart medal wrapped in tissue paper. It was the photograph tucked behind the sun visor, a young soldier in dress uniform standing next to this exact car, his arm around a beautiful woman in a yellow dress. On the back, someone had written in fatting ink, "For my darling Wren until we meet again. All my love, James." My sister has always been the one who fixes things in our family. At 34, she runs her own automotive restoration business just outside Nashville, and she's built a reputation for taking cars that other people write off as total losses and bringing them back to life. After our parents died in that accident 15 years ago, Celeste became my guardian, my anchor, and the person everyone in our extended family calls when life falls apart. She's practical where I'm impulsive, methodical where I'm scattered, and she has this gift for seeing potential in forgotten things. Standing there in that barn, watching her run her experienced hands along the Mustang's flawless bodywork, I knew she was seeing more than just a car. She was seeing a mystery that would consume her completely. Celeste gets that look in her eyes when she encounters something that doesn't make sense, something that needs solving. It's the same expression she had when she taught herself engine rebuilding at 19 because she couldn't afford to pay someone else to fix our car. It's the look that says she won't rest until she understands every detail of what she's discovered. The VIN number search came back with results that made no sense. According to every database Celeste could access, this car was purchased new on April 15, 1969, by Lieutenant James Dutton. But there was no record of registration, no insurance claims, no title transfers. For 54 years, this car had existed in a legal and bureaucratic void, as if it had simply vanished from the world the day it was bought. "That's impossible," Celeste said, staring at her laptop screen. "Cars don't just disappear from every system. Someone has to own it. Someone has to have been paying taxes on it, insuring it something." But every search led to the same dead end. James Dutton had died in Vietnam in October 1969, 6 months after buying the car, and somehow it had ended up in our grandfather's barn with no paper trail connecting the two men. As Celeste held that faded photograph, her voice caught in her throat. "Devin, what if Grandpa Tobias wasn't who we thought he was? What if he's been keeping someone else's secret all these years?" That question would drive everything that happened next, because my sister has never been able to walk away from a promise that needs keeping, especially one that involves the dead. 3 months had passed since we buried Grandpa Tobias on that gray March morning, and Celeste still couldn't bring herself to sleep in the farmhouse. Instead, she'd been camping out in her restoration shop in Nashville, driving the hour and 20 minutes to the property every weekend to tackle another room, another shed, another decade of accumulated memories that needed sorting. The Hartwell farm stretched across 40 acres of rolling Tennessee hills, land that had been in our family since 1847. Tobias had been the last one to actually work it as a farm, switching to cattle in the 1980s before finally leasing the pastures to neighbors when his arthritis made daily chores impossible. But he never stopped maintaining every building, every fence post, every piece of equipment like someday he might need it all again. "I don't understand how one person accumulates this much stuff," Celeste said, wiping sweat from her forehead as we stood in the main barn's doorway that Saturday morning in June. Inside, towers of hay bales created narrow pathways between collections of tools, furniture, farming equipment, and boxes labeled in Tobias's careful handwriting. "Christmas decorations 1987. Mom's dishes, good china. Devin's school papers." The weight of being the family keeper was wearing on her. Since our parents died in that head-on collision when I was 14 and she was 19, Celeste had been the one everyone turned to. She'd put herself through automotive school while raising me, built her business from nothing, and somehow managed to be present for every family crisis, every holiday, every moment when someone needed stability. Now, with Tobias gone, she was the last guardian of 4 generations of family history. Maybe we should just donate most of it, I suggested, knowing she'd never agree. As a journalist, I'm comfortable with letting stories go untold, but Celeste treats family history like sacred ground. She believes every photograph, every letter, every seemingly insignificant object might be the key to understanding who we really are. These aren't just things, Devon, she said, lifting a wooden crate filled with Tobias's military medals from World War II. These are pieces of people's lives. Once we throw them away, those stories are gone forever. She set the crate carefully in the keep pile, which was growing much faster than the donate stack. That's when she noticed something odd about the barn's back wall. The wooden planks didn't quite line up properly, and there was a draft coming from behind the hay bales that had been stacked there for what looked like decades. The bales were old enough that the binding twine had rotted away, leaving loose hay scattered across the floor, but they'd clearly been positioned deliberately to block something. "Help me move these," Celeste called, already pulling at the nearest bale. Underneath decades of dust and mouse droppings, we found a section of the wall that had been modified with hinges and a latch, disguised to look like the rest of the barn's interior. The hidden door opened into a space that Tobias had carved out of what should have been solid wall, big enough to hide something substantial. What we found took our breath away. Under a canvas tarp that looked military-issue sat the most beautiful car I'd ever seen. The 1969 Mustang Boss 302 was painted in grabber orange with black racing stripes, exactly the kind of car that teenage boys in 1969 would have dreamed about but never been able to afford. The chrome bumpers reflected our flashlight beams like mirrors, and when Celeste lifted the hood, the 302 V8 engine looked like it had been detailed yesterday. "This makes no sense," Celeste whispered, running her hands along the fender. "Look at this paint job, look at these tires. This car hasn't just been stored, Devon. Someone's been maintaining it. Someone's been coming out here regularly and keeping it perfect." The odometer showed 847 miles. In 54 years, this car had been driven less than most people drive in a month. Everything about it screamed that this wasn't just storage. This was preservation, the kind of careful, obsessive maintenance that comes from deep emotional attachment. Inside the car, that's where we found the first clues that this wasn't some random classic car that Tobias had been hiding from us. The glove compartment held a small wooden jewelry box, the kind that women kept engagement rings in during the 1960s. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a purple heart medal and 2 military dog tags stamped with DUTTON, James M., and his service number. But it was the photograph tucked behind the sun visor that stopped us both cold. A young man in army dress uniform stood beside this exact Mustang, his arm around a beautiful woman in a yellow dress. She was laughing at something he'd said, her hair caught in the wind, and the pure joy on both their faces was the kind you only see in people who believe they have forever ahead of them. On the back of the photo, someone had written in blue ink that was now fading to purple, "For my darling Wren until we meet again, all my love, James, April 1969. "Who is James Dutton?" I asked, but Celeste was already pulling out her phone, taking pictures of everything, documenting each detail like she does with every restoration project. "I have no idea," she said, but her voice had that tone that meant she was going to find out. "But Grandpa Tobias kept this car hidden for decades, Devon. People don't do that unless they're protecting something important." Looking back now, that was the moment everything changed. Standing in that hidden room, holding evidence of a story we'd never heard, we both felt the weight of secrets that had been carefully guarded. Tobias had always been private, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, but we'd never suspected he was actively hiding anything from us. The car was beautiful, valuable, and mysterious enough to capture anyone's attention. But what made it impossible to ignore was the emotion wrapped around it, the careful preservation, the hidden location, the personal items that spoke of love and loss and promises that transcended death. Celeste stood there in that dusty barn, holding a stranger's dog tags, and I watched her transform from a grieving granddaughter into a woman with a mission. Some people collect vintage cars as investments or hobbies, But this wasn't about money or nostalgia. This was about a story that needed finishing, and my sister has never been able to walk away from something that needs her attention. "We're going to figure this out," she said, not asking for my opinion but stating a fact. "Whatever Grandpa Tobias was protecting, whoever James Dutton was, and whoever Wren is, we're going to find the truth." The first thing Celeste did when we got back to her shop that evening was run the VIN number through every automotive database she had access to. As a licensed restoration specialist, she could pull records that most people never see. Insurance claims, registration transfers, lien information, even police reports if a car had been stolen or involved in accidents. What came back made no sense at all. "Look at this," she said, pointing at her computer screen. "The car was sold new on April 15, 1969 at Henderson Ford in Clarksville, Tennessee. Cash purchase $3,139. Buyer listed as James M. Dutton, age 22. She scrolled down through the sparse record. "And that's it. No registration renewal, no insurance claims, no title transfer, nothing. It's like the car vanished the day he bought it." I leaned over her shoulder to read the screen. Maybe he deployed right after buying it and never had a chance to register it. "That doesn't explain how it ended up in Grandpa's barn," Celeste said. "There has to be a connection between James Dutton and Tobias, but I can't find one anywhere." Over the next 2 weeks, Celeste became completely absorbed in solving the mystery. She started with military records, discovering that Lieutenant James M. Dutton had served with the 1st Cavalry Division and was killed in action near and Key on October 12, 1969, during what the Army called a routine patrol encounter. He was 22 years old, unmarried according to official records, and had no next of kin listed except for parents who had died in a house fire when he was 17. "He was an orphan," Celeste said, showing me the death certificate she'd obtained from the National Archives. "No family to inherit his belongings, no wife to notify. The Army would have handled everything through his commanding officer." But that created more questions than answers. If James had no family, who was the woman in the photograph? Who was Wren? And how did a car purchased by a dead soldier end up maintained in perfect condition in our grandfather's barn for 54 years? Celeste's investigation started affecting every other part of her life. She'd spend entire nights researching instead of working on paying restoration jobs. Customers began complaining about delays, and her business partner Meredith started fielding calls from frustrated clients who'd been promised their cars would be finished weeks earlier. "You're obsessing," I told her one Thursday evening when I found her at the shop at 11 p.m., surrounded by printouts of military records and old phone directories. "This is becoming unhealthy." She looked up from a magnifying glass she was using to examine the photograph. "What if this was your last chance to make something right, Devon? What if Grandpa Tobias spent 50 years carrying someone else's pain, and we're the only ones who can finish what he started?" "Or," I countered, "what if he had good reasons for keeping this secret? What if some stories are meant to stay buried?" That's when she showed me what she'd discovered about the car itself. Every part was original factory equipment, but each component had been carefully maintained or rebuilt using period-correct methods. The engine had been rebuilt at least 3 times over the decades, using the exact same specifications as the original. Even the tires were authentic Goodyear Polyglas GT models, which hadn't been manufactured since 1971. "Someone spent a fortune keeping this car exactly as it was in 1969, Celeste said. "This isn't just storage, Devon. This is preservation. This is someone who promised to keep something perfect forever." Our Aunt Cordelia, Tobias's only surviving child from his first marriage, came by the shop that Friday with a casserole and a warning. "Your grandfather was a private man who kept his business to himself," she said, setting the dish on Celeste's workbench. "Maybe you should respect that instead of digging into things that aren't your concern." "Did he ever mention James Dutton?" Celeste asked. "Or someone named Wren? Did he talk about Vietnam or any friends from the military?" Cordelia's expression tightened. "Your grandfather served his country and came home. That's all anyone needs to know." She paused at the door before leaving. "Some secrets are kept to protect people, Celeste. Think about that before you go stirring up old ghosts." But her warning only made Celeste more determined. That weekend, she drove back to the farm and went through every box in Tobias's house with forensic precision. She found his discharge papers from World War II, photographs from his service in the Pacific, letters from army buddies that mentioned nothing about Vietnam or anyone named James. "It doesn't make sense," she said, sitting on the farmhouse porch Sunday evening, surrounded by decades of our grandfather's carefully organized paperwork. Tobias was methodical about everything. He kept receipts for groceries from 1987, but there's no record of how he got this car, why he kept it, or who James Dutton was to him. The breakthrough came on Monday when Celeste found something she'd missed before. Hidden in the car's spare tire well was a small manila envelope containing a single sheet of paper. Orders dated September 15, 1969, assigning Lieutenant James M. Dutton to the 1st Cavalry Division, Vietnam. At the bottom, in faded blue ink, someone had written T. Hartwell, as promised. "Tobias knew he was going to Vietnam," Celeste said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone trusted our grandfather with this car before James deployed. But who? And why has no one come looking for it in 54 years? Finding that deployment order with Tobias's name changed everything for Celeste. She sat in the farmhouse kitchen that Monday night, staring at the faded handwriting, and made a decision that I knew would consume the next chapter of our lives. "I'm going to find Wren," she announced over the phone. "Whatever promise Tobias made, whatever he was protecting, she's the key to understanding all of this." "Celeste, we don't even know if this woman is still alive," I said. "It's been 54 years. People move, people die, people change their names when they get married." "Then I'll find her family. I'll find someone who remembers her. I'll find something." Her voice had that steel edge that meant arguing was pointless. "James Dutton trusted our grandfather with the most important thing in his life. The least we can do is honor that trust." Against my advice and despite Aunt Cordelia's increasingly sharp warnings about opening old wounds, Celeste threw herself into the search with the same methodical precision she brought to restoring engines. She started by enlarging and enhancing the photograph using software her business partner Meredith had for documenting restoration work. The woman's face became clearer, revealing delicate features and a smile that suggested she'd been genuinely happy when the picture was taken. The car's location in the photo provided the first real clue. Behind the Mustang, Celeste could make out part of a sign that read Fort Campbell and what looked like base housing in the background. James had been stationed at Fort Campbell before his deployment, which meant Wren had probably lived in the area during 1969. If they were engaged, there might be a record, Celeste reasoned. Marriage license applications, engagement announcements in local newspapers, something that would give me her full name. She took a week off from work, something she'd never done in the 15 years since starting her business, and drove to the Fort Campbell area. The local library's historical section became her second home as she combed through 1969 issues of the Clarksville Leaf Chronicle and the Oak Grove Tribune, looking for any mention of engagements, social events, or photographs that might include the woman from the Mustang. The breakthrough came on Thursday afternoon when she found a small social column from June 1969 titled Local Soldiers Send-Off Celebration. The grainy newspaper photo showed a group of young people gathered around a barbecue, and there in the background was the unmistakable silhouette of James's Mustang. More importantly, the caption identified several people in the photo, including Miss Wren Adelaine Summers, fiancée of Lt. James Dutton. "Wren Adelaine Summers," Celeste repeated, writing the name carefully in her notebook. "Now I have something to work with." The modern world made what would have been an impossible search in 1969 surprisingly straightforward. Social media, public records databases, and genealogy websites all contributed pieces of the puzzle. Wren had never married, instead keeping James's memory alive by using Adelaine as her middle name throughout her adult life. She'd moved to North Carolina in 1971, worked as a teacher for 37 years, and had spent her retirement volunteering with Gold Star families and veterans support groups. Finding her current address took 2 more days of cross-referencing property records and utility connections, but eventually Celeste traced Wren Summers Mitchell to a retirement community outside Asheville. The woman who had posed so joyfully beside that Mustang in 1969 was now 72 years old, and according to the community's website, still active in organizing events for military families. "This is it," Celeste said, holding her phone with Wren's number displayed on the screen. "This is the moment that changes everything." Her hands shook as she dialed. The phone rang 3 times before a clear, elderly voice answered. "Mrs. Mitchell, My name is Celeste Hartwell, and I think I have something that belongs to you. It's about James Dutton and a 1969 Mustang." The silence stretched so long that Celeste thought the call had dropped. Then came a whisper that carried 54 years of waiting. "I've been expecting this call my whole life." The drive to North Carolina felt like the longest 3 hours of my life. Celeste gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white, and neither of us spoke much during the trip. We both understood that whatever we learned from Wren would fundamentally change how we remembered our grandfather. Wren Summers Mitchell lived in a modest apartment at Sunset Ridge, a retirement community surrounded by the Blue Ridge Mountains. When she opened her door, I immediately recognized the woman from the photograph, though 54 years had softened her features and turned her dark hair silver. Her eyes, though, those were exactly the same, still bright with intelligence and warmth. "You look like him," she said to Celeste, studying her face carefully. "You have Tobias's eyes." She led us to her living room, where the walls were covered with photographs of military families, certificates from veterans organizations, and a single framed picture of James in his dress uniform. On her mantel sat a folded American flag and a small wooden box that looked identical to the one we'd found in the Mustang. "I knew this day would come eventually," Wren said, settling into her chair. "Tobias promised me it would, though I began to think he'd taken the secret with him to his grave." The story she told us was nothing like what we'd imagined. James had bought the Mustang in April 1969 as a surprise wedding gift, planning to present it to Wren on their wedding day that December. But he was also practical enough to know that young soldiers sometimes didn't come home from Vietnam, so he made arrangements with his best friend from childhood, our grandfather Tobias, to keep the car safe. "James and Tobias grew up together in foster care," Wren explained. "Different families, but they stayed close. Tobias was 10 years older and looked out for James like a big brother. When James got his deployment orders, he drove that beautiful car straight to your grandfather's farm and made him promise something that haunted Tobias for the rest of his life. The promise was simple but devastating. If James didn't come home from Vietnam, Tobias was supposed to give Wren the car and a letter James had written, but only when she was ready to move forward with her life. James knew she'd grieve, but he didn't want her to spend forever mourning him. The problem was," Wren continued, her voice catching slightly, "when James was killed in October, I completely fell apart. I left Clarksville, changed my whole life, and disappeared so completely that Tobias couldn't find me. He spent years trying, hearing private investigators, placing newspaper ads, anything he could think of to honor his promise to James." She opened the wooden box from her mantel and showed us its contents. Newspaper clippings with headlines like "Looking for Wren Summers" and "Information Wanted Missing Person," all placed by Tobias over the decades. There were letters from private investigators, photocopies of phone records, and even a 1987 missing person report filed in 3 different states. "Your grandfather never stopped looking for me," Wren said. "Even after I got settled in North Carolina and started using my middle name professionally, he kept searching for Wren Summers. He maintained that car perfectly year after year, waiting for the day he could finally keep his word." Then she told us about the letter. "James wrote it the night before he left for Vietnam. He sealed it and made Tobias promise to give it to me only when I was ready to live again, not just survive." Wren reached into the box and withdrew an envelope that had been opened and carefully resealed. "I finally got it last month." "Last month?" Celeste asked, confused. "Your grandfather found me 6 weeks before he died," Wren explained. "He'd been going through old military records, cross-referencing my maiden name with my volunteer work, and he finally made the connection. He drove all the way to North Carolina, brought me James's letter, and told me about the car. We spent 3 hours in my living room, 2 old people finally finishing a promise that had taken 54 years to keep." She handed the letter to Celeste with trembling fingers. "He wanted you to have this too, to understand why he kept the secret so long. Tobias said his biggest regret wasn't keeping the promise. It was taking so long to fulfill it." James's letter was everything you'd expect from a young soldier facing an uncertain future, but it was also something more, a love letter that transcended death and a challenge that took 54 years to accept. "My darling Wren," it began, "if you're reading this, then the worst has happened, but Tobias kept his word. I bought this car for our wedding day because I wanted you to have something beautiful that would last. But now I need it to mean something different. Every time you drive it, I want you to remember that you were completely loved, and that someone who loved you wants you to live the most amazing life possible." The letter went on for 3 pages, full of memories from their brief time together and dreams about the future they'd planned. But the final paragraph was what had taken Ren decades to understand. "I know you'll want to hold on to grief because it's the last thing connecting us, but grief isn't love, Ren. Love is what happens when you choose to live fully in my memory instead of dying slowly in my absence. Promise me you'll drive this car to places we never got to see together. Promise me you'll let someone else love you the way I did. Promise me you'll live for both of us." After reading it aloud, Ren wiped her eyes and looked directly at Celeste. "I spent 54 years thinking that moving forward would mean forgetting James, but your grandfather helped me understand that I'd been wrong. Keeping his memory alive didn't mean stopping my life. It meant living it in a way that would make him proud." The transformation in Ren over the following months was remarkable. She started by accepting the Mustang, which Celeste insisted on delivering personally after a complete mechanical restoration. But more importantly, she began using James's story to help other military families who were struggling with loss. Together, Ren and Celeste established the James Dutton Memorial Foundation, focused on connecting Gold Star families with lost mementos and undelivered messages from fallen service members. The Mustang became their first fundraising success, displayed at car shows and military events where its story helped raise both money and awareness. But the most unexpected development came 6 months later, when Ren called with news that changed everything again. "I've met someone," she said, her voice carrying a happiness I hadn't heard before. "His name is Robert, and he lost his wife in 2019. We met at the Veterans Support Group, and we've been talking about James and Margaret. That was his wife's name. We're not trying to replace what we lost, but we're thinking about building something new together." The following spring, Celeste and I attended Ren's wedding. At 73, she married Robert Chen, a retired Navy chaplain who had spent his own years helping military families cope with loss. They exchanged vows in the parking lot where James had first shown her the Mustang, with the restored car serving as the backdrop for their ceremony. "James was right," Ren told me after the service. "Living fully in someone's memory is so much better than dying slowly in their absence." Looking back now, I understand that what we found in that barn wasn't just a car or even a love story. It was a lesson about the difference between preserving the past and being imprisoned by it. Tobias had spent 54 years maintaining that Mustang not because he couldn't let go, but because he understood that some promises are worth keeping no matter how long it takes. Celeste returned to her restoration work with a new perspective, specializing in helping families preserve vehicles that carry emotional significance. Her business has become a bridge between past and present, helping people honor memories while still moving forward. And me, I finally learned the difference between being curious about family stories and being committed to understanding them. Some mysteries are worth solving not because they change the past, but because they help us live better in the present. If this story moved you like it moved us, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories. Because sometimes the most amazing discoveries happen when we're brave enough to look beyond what we think we already know.